Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Hashim Kumar. We start with some breaking news. The death of Libyan General Mohammed Al-Haddad in an aviation accident on Tuesday, just as he was holding high-level talks in Ankara on extending Turkey's troop deployment in Libya. A key architect of Libya's military unification and a central partner for Turkey, his loss risks unsettling Libya's fragile transition and shifting the regional balance. Turkey now sits at the crossroads of global power politics, balancing its interests between Russia, the USA, NATO obligations and commitments to Libya. To make sense of this complex mix, we're joined by Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Studies Centre. Mr. Giragosian, welcome to TVP World and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
So let's start with the death of General Al-Haddad. He'd been in conversations with Ankara about extending Turkey's troop presence in Libya. He'd also been responsible for, a key player at least, in moving towards Libya's unification after 10 years of civil war. What does his death mean for both of those issues?
Well, what we see with the tragic death and the airplane disaster, the loss of the Libyan chief of the military staff means that Turkey loses a key interlocutor, a key partner in Turkish ambitions in Libya. But for the Libyan side, I do think over the long term, the loss is much less significant. After all, this was not a democratically elected leader. This was rather a military officer from Libya. As important as his role was, I don't think it's necessarily going to undermine stability within Libya. But the bigger question is how Turkey proceeds and where their next partner will be in dealing with their ambitions for a greater role in Libya.
So why is Libya so important to Turkey?
I would argue it's not alone. In other words, Libya is, like Syria, only one of two foreign policy victories by Turkey. If we look at Turkish foreign policy over the past decade, it's been unfortunately marred by mistakes, created ambitions, and failed aspirations. Libya and Syria represent the two unique victories for Turkish foreign policy. What's interesting, however, is the broader strategic context. Turkey's ambitions in Libya rival that of Russia, which has been declining in its power within North Africa.
I want to come to Russia in just a second, but, when we talk about Turkish troop deployments in Libya, what are they protecting? Because there are, of course, maritime disputes with Greece and Egypt. So how does that dynamic work? Very briefly, if you would.
Well, Turkish military ambition in Libya is not about protecting anything. It's about projecting power and influence. And it may be a neo-Ottoman revival, a return to Turkey's roots, which is especially destabilizing.
Okay, now let's move on to Russia. I mean, during the war in Libya, Turkey was on the side of the national government, fighting against or defending against perhaps rebels which were supported by Russia. So they were on opposing sides. However, Turkey and Russia's relationship today doesn't seem to have made any difference, which side they were on during the war. Explain that to us.
That's a good point. What it demonstrates is Turkish ability and capacity to play both sides and actually to exploit Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. But the other area of ambition is the South Caucasus region, and that's where Turkish ambition and power is eclipsing the Russian position. So we should see a wider ramification from Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. Turkey, however, benefits no matter what happens. The real variable here is an unpredictable American administration. And unfortunately, that is the most distressing element of unreliability from Washington.
Right. I do want to come to the US and NATO, but before we do, is Turkey overextending? I mean, nationally speaking, its economy is in particularly good shape, its currency is weak. Can it afford to project in the way that it is currently attempting to do?
That's a very good question. And there are two observations. One is it is perhaps an example of overextension, where yet again Turkey is taking on too much. At the same time, a second observation is there is still an obsession with an inward focus by the Erdogan government in Turkey. In other words, all enemies, foreign and domestic. Since a coup 10 years ago, we see increasingly a paranoid Turkey and lashing out at all of her neighbors. So yes, the bottom line is this may be going too far too fast for Turkey.
Understood. Now let's move on to Turkey. I mean, Turkey is a member of NATO. How does it balance its commitments and obligations to NATO with what it's trying to do in the Mediterranean, with Libya, and of course its relationship with Russia?
Well, what we see is a new Turkey. We do see a demonstrable return to the NATO alliance by the Turkish government, perhaps a belated realization or memory that it is an important NATO member, but it has been for several years drifting closer to Russia and further away from the West. This is now undergoing a course correction, and we do see demonstrable signs of a return to normalcy. However, its position regarding Greece, Cyprus, the South Caucasus remains a factor not in NATO's unity, but in fractures and fragmentation within the alliance. Nevertheless, I think it's welcome Trump administration policies for Turkey that undermines democratic gains. And I do think Turkey will continue an authoritarian trend that is an additional burden for a NATO alliance.
Well, I mean, precisely. I mean, what does that mean for the reliability of Turkey, picking up its responsibilities should NATO require their support in a military context?
Well, Turkey historically has always been dangerously unreliable when it comes to crises. And if we look at global conflict, this is most evident. However, I do think NATO needs Turkey more than ever, especially given the challenge to not just Ukraine, but the threats to European security from Russian aggression and provocation. And whether it's Black Sea security or broader European stability, Turkey is going to play an increasingly important role. How to deal with authoritarian Turkey is another challenge, however.
Right, okay. Well, it's somewhat disconcerting that it is traditionally, historically unreliable and may well continue to be so in the future. What does that mean for Turkey's EU ambitions? I mean, is that door closed now?
Well, I can't even see the door anymore. In other words, unfortunately, EU aspirations have long faded within the Turkish government. I do think it's a mistake, it's a misstep, but Turkey is charting its own course. And now it's a return to Western ties and relationships, but much less about EU membership aspirations.
Okay, now talking about Western relationships, let's talk about the relationship between President Trump's administration and President Erdogan's administration. How would you characterize that relationship?
Well, it's transactional. Like everything with the Trump administration, it's a real estate deal. It's transactional. However, for Turkey, I do think President Erdogan is greatly relieved and encouraged that the Trump administration undervalues the importance of democracy and human rights. And we do see more of a recent breakthrough over the past 6 weeks regarding F-16 deal, regarding U.S.-Turkish relations on a bilateral level. But I do think for the Trump administration, they seem to be more comfortable in dealing with authoritarian leaders like Putin, like Erdogan.
Right. Okay. You mentioned the F-15 deal. Now, that, of course, is part of the agreement that Turkey reached to approve Sweden's membership of NATO. Erdogan took that as an opportunity to squeeze some concessions. How does that agreement by Turkey reflect what to expect in the future? In other words, do we expect each time we want Turkey to vote that it's going to squeeze some kind of concessions from the other NATO members?
Well, exactly. That's what I meant when I referred to the transactional approach Turkey has adopted. However, there's an added element, and we do see an additional compromise by Turkey to send back the Russian S-400 air defense system, which was a direct contradiction to U.S. policy. So we do see, yet again, Turkey playing both sides, but at the same time, returning to a Western embrace. And after all, Turkey and Russia are historic rivals, and I do think that rivalry will return. The current relationship, cooperation and coordination between Russia and Turkey is the aberration, not the norm.
Okay, yes, Turkey returned the S-400s, but that was a condition that President Trump imposed before supplying Turkey with U.S. weaponry. How is that relationship going? Because, of course, Turkey is now growing its own military manufacturing complex. How do you see that balance playing out?
Well, I see it more as recent imbalance. More specifically, what we see is the Turkish lead in unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, military drones, is now coming back to haunt Turkey. We see, for example, over the past week alone, Russian UAVs and drones attacking Turkish flag carriers in the Black Sea. We see drone warfare being used against Turkey. So it's rapidly losing that competitive advantage. I also think it's the European Union that is facing a much more serious challenge in replacing the unreliable Americans in being a primary security guarantor for Ukraine. In that context, Turkey can play a supportive role, both for European military capacity, but also in terms of Black Sea security.
Understood. Unfortunately, Mr. Giragosian, we're going to have to end it there, but thank you very much for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day, sir, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.